And now, our feature presentation.
Well kids, if there was ever a video in this history series that I have been hyped to dive into, it is absolutely 100% Hexen. Released on October 30th, 1995, Hexen is it was released as the sequel to Heretic back in 1995, but in these days, it's been officially branded more of a spiritual sequel rather than an official sequel. That's a whole can of monkeys that we'll open at some point. Developed by Raven Software and published by id Software, the game's full title, Hexen, Beyond Heretic, was definitely meant to ensure that gamers understood the connection between the two games, despite there being a massive shift in tone, gameplay mechanics, and overall atmosphere from one to the other. For real though, as I was preparing to sit and write this script, I went over my Heretic video to catch myself up on any details that I might have forgotten about, and just watching the difference in gameplay footage is stunning. Where Heretic is a straightforward Doom clone with fantasy elements added in, per John Carmack's suggestion at the time, Hexen hews closer to Raven's original design intentions for Heretic, a slower, darker, more labyrinthine game with light RPG mechanics, non-linear gameplay, and individual classes to choose from. While running on the same heavily modified version of the Doom engine that Heretic did, and while playing like a Doom engine game plays, Heretic breaks the standard run-and-gun mold with obtuse puzzles, engaging difficulty, and an oppressive atmosphere so dense you'd think you'd walked into the offices at Activision. It's like Raven was looking into the future or something. During development, there was an internal push to ensure that the game differed from its predecessor. Originally titled Heretic 2, somewhere along the way, Raven made the choice to go with Hexen instead. Honestly, it's a great choice. Hexen is a German word that translates as witches, but also as a verb, it means to work magic or to practice witchcraft, which Raven absolutely fucking did with this game. Further adding to this, executive producer John Romero wanted to lean into a darker, more oppressive atmosphere, and worked with series composer Kevin Schilder to guide the game's soundtrack in that direction. As Schilder completed tracks for Hexen, which are nothing but absolute bangers, FYI, he would deliver the files he was working on, and Romero would come back with notes on which ones needed to be toned down or turned darker, stuff like that. If you go through the game files, you'll notice that all the music tracks end in the letter R, which was Schilder's method of noting which pieces got the seal of approval from Romero during production. And speaking of the music, while we're here, we really need to cover the innovations that Hexen brought to the table in terms of what the Doom engine was capable of, and the boundaries that could be pushed in FPS gaming as a whole. First off, rather than rely solely on general MIDI tracks for the in-game music, Hexen was able to play high-quality versions of the music directly from the CD-ROM during gameplay. Unfortunately, the CD-ROM didn't contain the entirety of the game's soundtrack, so certain tracks in-game were relegated strictly to the general MIDI versions of those tunes. But as an added bonus to the higher quality music though, the game disc could be popped into your own personal CD player, allowing the player to listen to the soundtrack in the dark, dank privacy of their own bedroom. Or the, Hero's Keep, as I called it when I was 14. In addition to pushing the audio forward, Hexen's technology included some dramatic innovations, such as doors, crushers, and other objects that can either rotate or move horizontally as opposed to vertically. We've also got translucent weather effects such as fog, moving surfaces, pulsing lighting effects, but my personal favorite are the scripted sequences and complex environmental changes. Some of these are just fucking mind-boggling, and they still get me even though I've played this game so many times now. Monsters falling through stained glass ceilings, floors breaking and collapsing all around the player, enemies teleporting into the arena as walls open up to reveal hidden monster closets just when you thought you were safe. Switches in certain areas of the hub will open or unlock other areas in an entirely different hub map, leading to running, hunting, and searching constantly for things that affect your surroundings. And oh yes, that's right, kids. Hexen ditches the linear level gameplay that we've seen so far in the history of FPS and instead offers up a complex, maze-like, deadly series of hubs that have layers of interconnected maps full of puzzles that need to be solved if you want to move on to the next hub in sequence. It feels a lot like playing Mario 64, if Mario 64 existed in the Dark Souls universe. I already mentioned the fact that Hexen has moving surfaces and rotating doors, but I want to make sure that we highlight just how fucking revolutionary that was. You see, the Doom engine utilizes something called binary space partitioning, which isn't exactly friendly to dynamic geometry, but Raven programmer Ben Goki, who previously was responsible for implementing the revolutionary flying mechanics in Heretic, implemented something called polyobjects in order to create the moving doors and walls found in Hexen. Now, as you kids all well know, I'm not the technical guy, and I'm probably gonna botch this shit up if I even begin to try and make sense of it, but according to Wikipedia, polyobjects are one-sided lines built somewhere else on the map and rendered at the desired start spot when the level is loaded. This enables a pseudo-moving wall, not moving sectors, such as the tops of said moving doors. Now, all of this is controlled by something called Action Code Script, or ACS. This goes hand in hand with those scripted sequences I mentioned before. Doom and Heretic rely on lines within their maps to perform simple actions, but Hexen also permits these actions to be activated by ACS. This allows things like randomization, variables, and intermap script activation, aka pulling a switch on one map to open a door on a completely different map. ACS is also responsible for most of the game's special effects, like on-screen messages, randomized sound effects that appear as in-game ambiance, monster spawning, all the way up to those earthquakes that change the very landscape around you, manipulating floor textures and height. And with the changing in height at various times throughout the game, Raven once again implemented the ability to look up and down via key press in-game, as well as a jump button so players can traverse higher surfaces. A jump key in a Doom game. Just fucking think about how wild that must have been to experience for the first time. When you combine the technical revolution behind the scenes, the intense non-linear gameplay up front, and the gorgeous environment featured in gameplay and screenshots, Hexen did very well for itself on release. Critics raved about the gorgeous visuals, but especially the hub system, as well as the character class system, which offers loads of replayability as well as player choice within gameplay. Hexen was even runner-up for Computer Gaming World's Action Game of the Year award in 1995, barely losing out to Crusader No Remorse. But while the PC version received generally favorable reviews, the console ports, on the other hand, weren't as well received. Part of the problem with the console ports was that they weren't released until 1997, nearly 2 full years after the PC version's initial release. By this point, Hexen's visuals just didn't match up to what current-gen consoles were able to produce, and despite valiant attempts from developers Probe Entertainment, ATOD, and Software Creations, these ports were unfortunately dead in the water from the moment they dropped. While the Saturn and N64 ports were considered at least somewhat playable, the PlayStation version suffered from absolutely criminal frame rates and was thus deemed utterly unworthy. Hell, the PlayStation port required an entire 15 blocks of space just for one save game. 15 blocks of space! That's an entire PS1 memory card at the time. Interestingly though, the Saturn and PlayStation ports had CGI cutscenes that played between hubs. They're silly, cheesy, janky, and so much fun. Thanks to the efforts of Discord and channel friend Darth Agent 6, I was able to mod them into GZ Doom to watch them as I played through the game. Not only that, but he also got me a file to patch in the original CD quality audio to listen to in-game as I was going, which that felt fucking amazing. Now, there are a number of ways to play Hexen these days. There's the usual DOSBox method, as well as a port called Chocolate Hexen, but me, I prefer good old reliable GZ Doom. Just like with Heretic, I set my visuals to classic Doom rendering, but since there's so much to see above and below you this time around, I chose to utilize mouse look rather than up-down keys for more fluid movement. Even though Hexen is not nearly as fast-paced as Heretic is, there are still moments of panicked action as the game has a tendency to booby-trap and ambush the player with hordes of monsters out of nowhere. So, honestly, playing with full mouse look is what I consider the gold standard for this experience. Alright kids, now that we've covered some background and mechanical information, it's time to dive into the meat and potatoes of the actual experience of Hexen, which is, zero hyperbole, my favorite Doom engine game of all fucking time. Where Heretic chronicled the heroic journey of a single hero, Hexen's story belongs to not one, but three separate warriors. Picking up where Heretic left off, Hexen takes place in a completely separate dimension called Chronos, where the humans of the realm have basically factioned themselves into three separate yet equal controlling groups: the warriors of the Legion, the mages of the Arcanum, and the clerics of the Church. While each faction controls a separate aspect of humanity, they all work together to maintain the whole of human society, while keeping the other factions in check so no one has too much power. However, one of those pesky serpent riders, this time one named Corax, has seduced each of the leaders of the three factions in order to covertly gain control over Chronos. Zedek of the Legion, Traductus of the Church, and Melnikir of the Arcanum were all rewarded with the dark gift of unlife by Corax in return for their allegiance. Using unlife and the artifacts already under their control, the three leaders quickly took control of all of humanity, except for three brave souls: Baratus, warrior of the Legion; Daedolon, mage of the Arcanum; and Parias, cleric of the Church. Each of the three set out on a mission to destroy each of the three leaders of the factions of Chronos, and then make their way to the Serpent Rider Corax and remove him from this plane of the universe. As you kids have probably guessed already, we're going to be playing through Hexen as one of these three heroes. Now, each of them have their strengths, their weaknesses, and even their own set of weapons to use throughout the course of the game. Hell, even certain items that we collect in our inventory will be used differently by each class. So with that being the case, I'm not going to talk about each class here in this section of the video. For now, I'm just going to dive into the world, the hubs, and the monsters of Hexen, and we'll get into each class in a separate chapter. Because let me tell you something, kids. I've played Hexen 3 times in a row for the purposes of this video, once as each class, and you'd better believe that the only real way to talk about this game is to have played through from start to finish as each of these classes. Because if you don't, then you're really only getting a third of the experience. As we've already covered, Hexen is divided up into a series of hubs, rather than episodes with linear missions to run through one after the other. Hexen contains 5 hubs, along with 1 prologue map and 1 epilogue map. We have the Winnowing Hall prologue, the 7 portals, the Shadowwood, the Heresiarch Seminary, the Castle of Grief, the Necropolis, and then finally, the Dark Crucible epilogue. In a sense, each hub itself represents a kind of chapter, if you will, or even an episode of the FPS experience. I compared the hubs a minute ago to playing Mario 64 Dark Souls, but unlike Mario 64, where we would find ourselves searching Peach's castle to enter a painting, complete a mission, and then return to the castle hub in order to seek out new paintings with new missions, Hexen's hubs are a very different beast. Rather than each portal inside the hub representing a singular mission to complete and then move on to the next, Hexen's portals and areas within all act as spokes that lead to brand new environments. The central hub will have a primary puzzle that we will have to solve in order to eventually move on to the next, while the maps inside the portals are all interconnected with their own smaller puzzles and objectives. By solving the mysteries within each portal, one by one, we will slowly piece together the solution to the main puzzle in the center hub. But the real tricky bit about all of this is that the items required to open up a door or an arena in one portal are sometimes located within a different portal altogether. So we'll have to search every nook and cranny of each portal for keys, switches, and triggers that could potentially unlock or unblock something on a different portal, where we'll need to then continue searching for solutions and answers until we at last piece everything together, solve all the aspects of all the portals, and then, in doing so, collect what we need to unlock the central puzzle in the hub and continue on our journey. Now if that sounds exhausting and confusing already, then hold on to your swords, kids, because you don't even know the fucking half of it yet. Now, what's really neat about this sequence of events is that each hub and their portals present a slowly escalating series of challenges that not only evolve over time, but establish a basic roadmap for what the next hub is going to present to us, the player. So for example, the opening prologue, Winnowing Halls, leads us along a winding path towards a series of switches and hallways hidden behind breakable stained glass. There are keys to find, crushing walls to avoid, and enemies that teleport in to give us cause for caution. Not only that, but the map itself demonstrates something paramount to understanding how Hexen works. It forces us along a set path towards an objective, and once we've completed that objective, when we backtrack to the start, we find that aspects of the area have changed. We're also introduced to the fact that certain enemies can and will spawn into areas we've already visited if we cross certain triggers or activate certain switches. In fact, we're also going to see that the base enemy of the game, the Ettin, can and will randomly respawn into an area just as a way of keeping the player on their toes. Ettins are pretty much the imps of Hexen, but don't let these assholes fool you into thinking that they're pushovers. Every single enemy in Hexen can and will fuck you up faster than you can scroll through your inventory for a healing potion if you are not careful. And the fact that Hexen utilizes ACS scripting to randomly respawn more Ettins into maps, you're going to be checking corners frequently and listening for the distinct sound of monsters teleporting in, because it means that no area is ever really truly safe, no matter how many of these damn things you kill. We'll also get a brief glimpse of the Afrits here, but we're going to get a better look at them once we cross over into the 7 portals, which, by the way, opens up like this.
Greetings, mortal. Are you ready to die?
Shit. Corax is an insanely good villain. Insanely good. Each hub will open with a brief message from the Serpent Rider, peering at you from wherever he's perched himself as lord over all of this chaos, with increasingly ominous threats the deeper you get into the game. With each new hub bringing not only new threats of violence, but bigger, badder, more terrifying atmosphere, Corax's presence as a mover and shaker and ultimate threat is absolutely felt throughout the whole of the game. Of course, whether or not he lives up to the hype as a final boss fight remains to be seen, but for now, we'll stay focused on the 7 portals. The hub of the 7 portals will lead us to 3 separate and distinct areas: the Guardian of Ice, the Guardian of Fire, and the Guardian of Steel. Now, the hub lives up to its name since there are, in fact, 7 portals for us to enter. 6 of them will lead to each of the 3 maps I've just mentioned. In other words, 2 portals per map, and 1 will lead us out and into the next hub, the Darkwood. When we first arrive here, however, we can only access one of the portals after activating a switch. Each portal is sequestered behind a heavy door that requires a switch of some kind to open it up, so we don't exactly have unlimited access off the jump. We're gonna have to earn it. 7 portals, much like winnowing halls, takes us by the hand and gives us instructions as to how to solve and navigate the hub, but not quite as direct as the prologue did. For example, there are switches that specifically solve parts of the puzzle in the hub, and when we find them, we're greeted with the message, 1/3 of the puzzle has been solved on the 7 portals. And when we've completed a puzzle, we'll get a message like, stairs have risen on the 7 portals. We'll even get cryptic messages like, stones grind on the 7 portals. This is our reminder that the hub is changing and moving around as we complete tasks, prompting us to return to the 7 portals in order to see what it is that has altered. However, as we progress deeper into the game, we're not going to be led around as directly. As stairs rise, we'll be given access to switches that open up the other doors in the hub, which will offer a secondary entrance to one of the Guardian maps. As each Guardian map has its own series of traps, puzzles, and locked doors, some areas will be barred off until we gain access to the second portal over on the hub, giving us the opportunity to search new parts of the map and discover new items, switches that affect the hub or other Guardian maps, and keys that we might need somewhere else. Eventually, we will solve all the puzzles and hit all the switches and open up all the doors to the final portal, which is tantalizingly just out of reach until we take the time to defeat the remaining monsters around us. Once that task is completed, magic stairs, yes, literally magic stairs, we're gonna see a lot of those, will appear over the gap for us to cross and will take the final portal to the next hub. Of course, if we're in a hurry, we could just drop onto this ledge over here and then take some stairs up to a Wings of Wrath item and then just fly across the gap so we don't have to kill everything first. Then again, before we leave, we might want to hit the secret level. Every hub has a secret level, and conquering said level will generally land us a powerful item for our inventory, usually an Icon of the Defender, which grants temporary invincibility, or a Crater of Might, which completely refills both blue and green mana. Now, that might not seem like much, but let me tell you, in this game, those icons and craters are incredibly precious resources. Hexen uses the same revolutionary inventory system that Heretic introduced, in which your character will pick up consumable items that you can choose to activate whenever you want. We'll have the quartz flasks for health, these neat little green bottles called flechets, which will react differently depending depending on which character you are, speed boots, discs of repulsion, a whole lot of items which are best learned through experimentation versus explanation. Although one of the best of the lot is the Porculator, which shoots out magic eggs that transform enemies into little tiny pigs that you can
Crushed into tiny little pieces of sausage meat.
And unlike Heretic, Hexen's inventory items carry over from one hub to the next, so stocking up and stacking those items for future holy shit moments is going to be crucial. In fact, the game is counting on you doing so. Alright, I've kind of glossed over the general basics of 7 portals, but you kids have to understand that this first hub is doing a lot of heavy lifting. A lot. First off, outside of being introduced to the general concepts of how to navigate the game's hubs, we're also introduced to the primary roster of enemies that we will meet in the game. Ettins, Afrits, Chaos Serpents, which have green and brown variants. The green ones breathe fireballs, and the brown ones breathe poison. And Centaurs, which... Centaurs are probably the most unique enemy in the game because of their mechanics. See, they carry a shield around with them, and if they take any amount of damage, they will raise their shield and then block any further incoming damage until they drop their shield a moment later. But you're gonna have to wait for that to happen if you want to hit them again, because if you happen to try and attack with a projectile while their shield is up, that projectile will reflect off of it and bounce back, potentially in your direction, potentially harming you instead. Anytime these fuckers are on screen, the usual wild flailing of weapons and items needs to be dialed back and replaced with strategy, because they can and will slow your progress down in an instant. I almost want to devote an entire chapter to the Centaurs just because they... Nope! I'm gonna get off track if I don't focus. Fucking Centaurs. 7 Portals also gives us one of the nastier enemies in the game, the Wendigo, but fortunately, these fuckers only appear here on the Guardian of Ice level. They're mean, tough, and their attacks not only do a fuck ton of damage, but the projectiles they throw will shatter if they miss you and hit a nearby wall. This sends a bunch of shards flying in multiple directions that also do damage, meaning you're still probably getting hit even if they miss you. Secondly, 7 Portals is teaching us in the background how important it is to pay attention to architecture and design of the maps, and that if we do so, we'll be able to logically assess and decipher the environmental puzzles. For example, when we first arrive on the Guardian of Steel, there are 2 chain switches that don't appear to do anything when we pull them. They'll just immediately reset. Meanwhile, down below, there's 2 corridors that lead to other switches and items for us to gather. One is open, and the other is closed off. We just have to figure out how to open the other path. The way it works is that the wall blocking our entrance to the second path is actually a sliding wall. We can control the sliding wall using the 2 switches up above, one on the northeast side of the map, and the other on the southeast. They're strategically placed so that if we run down, say, to the southeast switch, it will cause the wall to slide to the south, opening up the north corridor. But if we go to the northeast switch and activate that, it will slide the wall to the north and open up the south corridor. Of course, Hexen will end up using this solution against us later on. On the opposite side of the same map, there's another sliding wall puzzle with 2 similar passages leading to 2 similar switches. The setup is the same, but here's the twist. On this side of the map, the switches that control the sliding wall are reversed. The northwest switch slides the wall to the south, and the southwest switch slides the wall to the north. It's a subtle trap, one designed to intentionally take advantage of a player's assumptions, and is also here to inform us one thing: don't assume how this shit works. A simpler environmental puzzle that 7 Portals uses to teach the players to literally look everywhere around them is in the Guardian of Ice. We walk into an ice-covered room. There's a couple of Wendigos to fight, but then suddenly the room shakes and shifts and transforms around us. At the opposite end of the room is a set of icy stairs with what looks like a key that we need to reach at the top of them, but the stairs only just go into the ceiling so that we can't quite reach the key. So how do we gain access to the key? Well, the answer is real simple, but very deceptive. See, when the room shook and shifted a moment before, in the chaos of all the earthquake sound effects playing, a wall opened up in the back to reveal a switch that will lower the ice steps so we can grab the key. It's difficult to hear the sound of it, and it's behind us as we enter the room, so there isn't much reason for us to naturally turn around and explore that area since our attention is drawn in front of us. This puzzle teaches the player, always turn around and look behind you. Okay, so moving forward, with all of these lessons in mind, now we're going to look at how the hubs and puzzles of Hexen evolve and continually ask the player to pay attention to their surroundings.
My servants can smell your blood, human.
Next up is the Shadowwood, where the game truly lets us loose into the confusing and confounding world of Hexen. Here we're going to find portals to several new areas: the Dark Mere, the Caves of Circe, and the Wastelands. We've also got another secret level to find, the Sacred Grove. In the swamps of the Dark Mere, we're introduced to a new enemy, the Stalker, which is somehow one of my favorite and also least favorite enemies in the game. Aquatic fuckers that look like the creature from the Black Lagoon, who come in two flavors. One that stays below the water until you get too close, popping up like a jack-in-the-box to take a melee swipe at you, and another that will hide underwater for a few moments, but then pop up to throw a green fireball at you from across the arena. These guys will fucking... When you're in large water-filled areas like the Dark Mere, these things can and will be anywhere and everywhere. You'll know they're around because you'll see their backs hump out of the water for a moment as they're swimming, and also by the audio cues of them sludging around. The gross thing about their attacks is that they don't always pop up in front of you. Depending on positioning, they could pop up to the side or even right behind you. Fighting stalkers is strictly about the audio cues. You'll have half a second between their emergent sound effect and them landing a really painful attack. So, if you're quick on the reflexes, you can turn and or dodge to the side. But if you're not paying attention, or if you're surrounded by them, you're going to take so much damage in so short a time that you're pretty much dead the moment you step in the water. Shadowwood, as a hub, is a lot more expansive than Seven Portals. There's certainly more area to explore and navigate, but also more elements to interact with, such as the tower puzzle you need to solve in order to open the portal to the Dark Mere. Also, where Seven Portals guided us forward by letting us know that stairs had risen or doors had opened, Shadowwood plays it a little closer to the chest. There's an outpost-like structure in the Shadowwood, which is the location of the hub's central puzzle, and it requires 6 switches to be activated in order to be completed. Now, of course, the average FPS player is probably thinking, it's 6 switches? How the hell am I supposed to know where they are? Well, that's the beauty of it. The game will essentially tell you. Here in the Shadowwood's outpost, there's 6 blank windows that, when a switch has been swatched, light up with an image related to the area that you activated the switch in. 6 switches, 3 areas to explore, 2 switches per area. This will help players have a general idea of where they need to go if they're still missing 1 or 2 switches. Another concept that's evolving here is the notion that keys are not strictly relegated to use in just one area. So, we picked up the Fire Key and the Steel Key back in the 7 Portals, and they were used exclusively on the Guardian of Fire and Guardian of Steel maps, respectively. But here, we're going to find the Swamp, the Cave, and the Horn Keys, and at times, we're going to need all 3 in order to progress through a level. For example, here in the Badlands, we're going to need the Cave Key to gain access to a teleporter that will zap us into a dangerous melee in order to find one of the 6 switches. And then, we'll need the Swamp Key to be able to lower a barrier that reveals the location of the second of the 6 switches hidden in the Badlands. Both the Dark Mere and the Caves of Circe require keys from other maps in order to progress. Before, we learned to look for keys in different maps to use on one specific map, and now we have to find the keys and use them in multiple maps. Shadowwood's Outpost is also an evolution in that, as we find the switches and progress, the architecture of the building will change. But this time, we won't be told by the game through messages that things have been altered. It's up to us this time to remember that our environments will shift as we complete certain actions, and so we will need to return to the outpost and explore to see what is new and what has now been granted access to us. The secret level here is also not advertised that it is opened. From the outset, there's a rising set of natural stairs to a blocked off portal, and try though we might, we won't be able to open it. At least, not until we found all 6 switches for the portal to leave the Shadowwood. Now, if you're in a bit of a hurry, once you know that you've gotten the 6 switches necessary to leave, you'll probably rush back down to the outpost, walk through the portal, and head on about your business. But if you hop back up to the blocked off portal at this point, it will have opened and we can access the Sacred Grove. This secret level is super unique in that it is simply a very small arena. There's a short fight with some Ettins, and then the floor sinks down to give you access to a switch. When you activate it, you get the message, a door has opened on the Forsaken Outpost. And that's it, you can leave. Collect some mana, and get out of here. Now, I do keep referring to the building in the Shadowwood as an outpost because that's the best term that I've got for it, but that's not the Forsaken Outpost. No, we're gonna have to figure out what that actually is on our own at some point. Of course I'm going to tell you what it means. You think I'm a bad dad? Just not yet. We'll get there. Because first, crossing the portal to leave the Shadowwood brings us to a boss arena called the Hypostyle. Surprise! Now, this is a fairly easy section to run through. There's a compass in the center of the room that will point you in the direction you need to go as you open up the building room by room, where you'll need to clear out any monsters that you find. Once all of this has been done, we'll be able to enter a wide arena surrounding an open pit of lava. And as we do, we see this bullshit. That's the Death Wyvern, and do not take it for granted. A flying pterodactyl-looking motherfucker who vomits fireballs that do heavy damage, but also explode for a large area of effect splash damage afterwards if you're too close. It flies around the room, ducking and dodging your attacks, which can make fighting it a bit tricky depending on the class you've chosen. But fortunately, there's a Wings of Wrath pickup in the area, so we can fly circles around the bastard as well, and finish him off pretty quickly if we stay out of range. And now, we're on to the Heresiarch Seminary.
Worship me, and I may yet be merciful. Then again, maybe not.
This hub really starts to bring the bullshit, and yet is one of the more interesting hubs in the game. I might even go so far as to say that it's the most important. First off, we're introduced to a brand new enemy, the Dark Bishop. These guys are essentially redrawn sprites of the Disciples of Despair from Heretic, but they're much more insidious mechanically. They'll sometimes teleport from side to side, becoming intangible when they do so, and will launch a stream of spiraling fireballs in your direction when they eventually stand still. Even worse, they can fly, so they'll come at you from all directions, and will sometimes hide in deep pits to rise up and ambush you. Not only that, but they explode when they die, and that will do damage to you if you're too close when it happens. We also get introduced to a variant of the Centaur, the Slaughtar. Slaughtars operate exactly the same way as Centaurs, but there's a twist in that the Slaughtar can launch blue energy bolts at you from their shield. So sometimes they'll look like they're just trying to block your attacks, but other times they will have their shields up and they'll start attacking out of nowhere. It is far too easy to be caught off guard with these things if you're not careful, and it adds another layer of strategy to your combat. The Seminary is a very different beast from what we've seen before, because his hub is split into two objectives: the initial puzzle and the primary puzzle. Now, at first, the Seminary appears to have very little for us to do. There's a bunch of hidden switches that manipulate the environment around us, which is much more direct than what we've done previously, but there's also a stone setting in the chapel, which appears to be missing a number of gemstones. First off, we're tasked with locating the gemstones. This means figuring out how to open up the Seminary to find the portals to two maps: the Silent Refectory and the Orchard of Lamentations. The Refectory holds 3 of the gems, and the Orchard holds the other 2. Once we've tracked down all the gems and placed them into the stone setting, we're then granted access to portals to 3 new maps: the Wolf Chapel, the Dragon Chapel, and the Griffin Chapel. We'll also take notice that there are 9 blank windows here, meaning there are now 9 switches to find to complete the main puzzle. 3 chapels, 3 switches per chapel. Alright, don't start shouting and getting angsty right away. These switches are all super easy to find, probably because we've already done a lot of heavy lifting in the Seminary by opening doors, revealing hidden walls, and generally become a secret hunting agent of chaos all on our own. Depending on the order you tackle the chapels, you can even find all 3 switches in one run. My personal favorite method is to get 1 in the Wolf Chapel, then 2 in the Griffin Chapel, then all 3 in the Dragon Chapel, followed by the last one in the Griffin Chapel, and then finally the last 2 in the Wolf Chapel. And yeah, that's a little specific on how to do it, but certain doors and barriers in the Wolf and Griffin Chapels will only open up once you've gotten certain switches in the Dragon Chapel. Trust me when I say, that is the easiest method of bouncing between the 3. The Seminary, at first glance, is one of the most tricky hubs in the game. It's also leaning heavily on something we're going to need for the hub after this one: environmental puzzles and contextual clues. The gemstones necessary to unlock the 3 chapel portals are never directly told to us that they will go in the stone setting. As we progress, we pick up different stones and are just kind of expected to figure out where they go. But if we just look at the setting for a moment and understand that there's 1 gemstone in there already, experimentation will lead us to placing the other stones we find into the right setting. Another thing that I want to point out about this hub is that there are no keys. No keys, no doors to unlock. Everything here is strictly based on experimentation and observation. Running through this the first time felt like one of the most tedious, ineffective, sloggy puzzles I have ever had to go through. This, at the time, was when I had no idea what I was doing, nor what the game was asking of me. In hindsight, though,
don't worry, this is kids' play.
Learning isn't always fun, kids, and let me tell you, this is a necessary lesson. So we've set all the stones in place, and we've cleared all the 9 switches. Now, back in the seminary, we're gonna have to face down our next boss fight, which is handily the most devious fight in the entire game, the Heresiarch himself. Now, we got a glimpse of this guy back at the end of Heretic. Yeah, that red fucker in the robes, that's the Heresiarch. He's one of the Serpent Rider's top dogs, and his boss fight proves that. On an interesting note, the Heresiarch was originally meant to be the design for Corax, up until some point during development, where that idea was scrapped, and then Corax was redesigned. But fighting against the Heresiarch here, you can really see how this was originally meant to be the final boss of the game at the outset, because fighting him kind of feels a lot like fighting Desperal. The Heresiarch has a couple of different attacks, such as shooting a stream of purple fireballs, summoning twin fireballs that will bounce around and try to home in on the player, and when his health is low, he'll start summoning dark bishops into the arena to distract the player. But the worst thing he does is that he will surround himself with a couple of glowing purple orbs that act as a reflective shield. When this happens, anything projectile based that you throw at him will bounce right off, just like with the centaurs. This is tricky and frustrating, but it isn't the worst thing in the world, as each character class has methods of combat that can bypass a reflection shield. It's just that you're gonna have to be real tricky about it. Once the Dark Bishops start to enter into the arena, you'll know you're getting close, and not too long after that, he'll disintegrate into a skeleton. When he is defeated, the whole of the seminary will tremble, and the portal to the exit will open up. Of course, we still have a secret level to hit. Over near the chapel portals, a group of pillars will now activate, granting access to the seminary's secret level, the Deathwind Chapel. I fucking hate the Deathwind Chapel. It is mean, it drags, it will test your patience and your determination, and all of this is really great. I love that I hate it. Jesus. I fully recommend grabbing the Wings of Wrath that are located near the hub exit portal before going into the Deathwind Chapel, because you're gonna need them to help you get around the lava pool in the initial stage of the map. Here's a fun fact about the Wings of Wrath in this game. Once you activate them, they will stay active in whatever hub you're in, and will only wear off once you cross into the next hub. They usually appear near the end of the hub, so once you've found them, take a second, go flying back through all of the portals in the hub, and go find some neat secrets and items that you couldn't reach before. But once we've got that done, it's time for my personal favorite hub, and the one with the most interesting challenges in the entire game, the Castle of Grief.
You have played this game too long, mortal. I think I shall remove you from the board.
From the jump, this hub is 100% not fucking around. Dark Bishops, Slaughtars, Chaos Serpents, Stalkers, Ettins, Afrits, the gang is all here as we land outside the titular Castle of Grief, and it is basically a full frontal assault on the tower to find the way beyond. So, we've talked about contextual clues and items for placement in the seminary. Now, Castle of Grief fully embraces that lesson and provides us with our test. Much like the seminary, we're going to have to run around the 4 ramparts of the castle to locate 4 switches inside, and then drop down to the exterior of the castle to find another 4 switches. Getting all of these grants us access to 4 clockwork gears scattered around the castle grounds, which we then need to slot into the correct placements. Once this is done, a platform will rise and fall in the center of the tower, which will take us inside the castle to the gibbet itself for the primary puzzle solving. Inside the gibbet, we'll get access to 2 other maps, the Effluvium and the dungeons. Meanwhile, there's another portal located outside the castle grounds, which will take us to a map called the Forsaken Outpost, and maybe here we can actually discover that door we opened back in the Sacred Grove. Yeah, you kids remember that? The secret level 2 hubs ago? That's how far Hexen is ahead of you. 2 entire fucking hubs! We'll see a return to the usage of keys, in that we'll need to find a dungeon key and an axe key, both of which open specific doors inside the gibbet. In fact, the gibbet itself is a kind of a hub within a hub, in that we will find access to the effluvium and the dungeons from here, and we'll need to travel back and forth between those 2 maps and the gibbet itself. Part of why I love the Castle of Grief so much is that it is densely layered, with a hub inside a hub, and multiple maps all interconnected, so it feels like you're just meandering through one singular structure and slowly making your way to the center of it all. Going back to the idea of contextual items we need to find, while there are 2 keys necessary for opening specific doors, what we're really looking for in order to manipulate the environment are specific items that need to be placed in specific areas. For example, there's a library inside one of the rooms of the gibbet with multiple bookshelves. Exploring the Forsaken Outpost will grant us 2 books, which, if we're paying attention, we can then take to the library and place on a blood-stained bookshelf. Some of the shelves lower were attacked by bishops, and we will find something called Yorick's Head. In another part of the gibbet is a headless statue. Well, observation says that we've got a head and the statue doesn't have one, so placing the head on the statue causes an earthquake that lowers some water in the center of the gibbet, giving us access to a teleport switch which drops us inside the effluvium, and we begin a labyrinthine journey hunting for switches and secret passageways to manipulate the castle until we finally return to the gibbet and are told, you hear a door open upstairs. Of course, this is somewhat of a trick, because it isn't a door per se. It's a pillar that has split in half, allowing us to enter a cage where the axe key lowers on a pedestal, and then we can unlock the axe door in the gibbet. This is the throne room, and as we enter, the doors lock behind us, and we are then assaulted by waves of monsters, until at last, the back of the throne room opens up, and we have to face off against a somehow resurrected Heresiarch. This fight is slightly meaner than the first encounter in the Seminary, as there is a 5-pointed star made out of lava that the Heresiarch likes to hang out on, making it trickier to engage in combat with the magical fiend. Of course, the same rules apply, and patience leads to victory, and then on to the next hub. Oh wait, that's right. You probably want to know about that door that opened in the Forsaken Outpost, don't you? Oh, alright. So, in the Forsaken Outpost, if we activated the switch in the Secret Grove previously, then when we pick up the second of the 2 books that need to go into the library, a door will open to reveal a portal. This portal then takes us to the Desolate Grove, which, like the previous secret levels, is basically there to provide an icon of the defender or a crater of might to keep you topped up on powerful supplies. However, Desolate Grove also contains all 3 pieces of each class's ultimate weapon, as a way of providing players with a little extra boost just in case they had somehow missed any of these 3 pieces located throughout the campaign. I'm going to touch on the building of the ultimate weapon aspect of the game when I talk about the classes, so just put a pin in that for now. Alright, so, final hub time, the Necropolis.
Are you strong enough to face your own masters?
This hub is the single most straightforward out of the 5. No keys, no switches, just contextual items and dungeon crawling to what is essentially a 3-part boss rush. The long and short of it is, there are 3 tombs for us to open here in the Necropolis. Each tomb contains one of the 3 leaders of humanity that Corax has corrupted, and we're gonna have to make our way through each of the tombs to find them and fight them. Each tomb is themed around their respective classes. Zedek's tomb is based around the fighter class, and so we'll basically have to muscle our way through endless hordes of centaurs, slaughtars, and ettins in order to activate the switches to reveal the boss. Triductus' tomb is based around the cleric, with a mixture of magic and melee. And Melnikir's tomb is based around the mage and requires a bit more brain power, asking the player to deduce which correctly shaped switches and sigils to activate in order to fight that boss. And the Necropolis also introduces the final enemy for us to tackle in the game, the Reavers. These resurrected warriors come popping out of the graves of the Necropolis left and right, and while they're not that difficult to kill, their fireballs pack a mean punch, and they can drain your health if you get too close to them. They only appear in the graveyard, however, so you won't have to worry about them as you navigate the tombs. Defeating each boss will grant a special sigil based around the boss's class. Once you have all 3, you can place them in a stone setting in the Necropolis, which unlocks a series of doors for you to cross, gather up some mana along the way, and then step into the portal that leads to the epilogue, the Dark Crucible. And yeah, that's basically it for the 5th hub. I know some players might find that a little weak compared to the previous hubs, especially the fantastically layered Castle of Grief, which is honestly a showstopper of game design and interconnected mechanics, but I feel very positive around the Necropolis. There's a decent challenge to be had in fighting Reavers between tombs, and each of the tombs is no joke. In fact, fighting the 3 corrupted leaders is no joke either. They essentially move like multiplayer bots and are all armed with their class's ultimate weapon. If you're not moving fast or hitting them as hard as you can and will die real fucking fast to their attacks. Also, the Necropolis has a secret level just like all the other hubs, but I didn't find it during this playthrough because I didn't realize that you have to go directly to the secret level before you enter any of the tombs, because if you enter any of the tombs before you go to the secret level, you will have unintentionally locked yourself off from the secret level because this game is mean, it is hurtful and harmful, and I love it. So I'm just gonna have to get that secret level another time. But at last, here we are, the Dark Crucible, the end of the siege. There's no posturing, no ominous threats, just a big fucking serpent rider named Corax, who, as we enter the arena, is already attacking us. Now, compared to everything we've been through, the 2 fights with the Heresiarch and the corrupted leaders, Corax is a bit of a letdown in terms of boss fights. Depending on how stacked you are on health and invincibility items, all you have to do is basically unload your ultimate weapon into Corax enough times and he's done for. Of course, Corax has 2 stages. First, it's just him, surrounded by environmental traps. After taking enough damage, he teleports away, leaving you to the mercy of a massive wave of Ettins. And then, Centaurs. After you cut through all of those, the doors to the inner sanctum will open up, revealing Corax surrounded by a legion of Chaos Serpents. All you have to do, though, is focus your attacks on Corax, stay out of harm's way long enough, and you'll cut the bastard down to reveal the final portal out of here. And Hexen is conquered. There's some excellent flavor text that informs us that we've discovered the Chaos Sphere, the source of Corax's power, and as we decide what we're going to do with it, there's an ominous glimpse of a red hand reaching out to move a chess piece on a cosmic board towards a piece that looks like our player character, ending with a threat of still one more serpent rider to come and potentially endless evil still yet to manage. So, to sum all of this up, Prologue teaches us that we will need to find keys, pull switches, and the world will shift around us as we do so, meaning we will need to do some backtracking to see what has actually changed. Hub 1 takes a concept of keys and evolves them into keys that are themed based on the area where we will need to use them, and expands the concept of moving back and forth through our environment by asking us to pay attention to changes not only in the 3 areas we will travel between, but in the central hub itself. It also demonstrates that we will be looking for specific switches that solve a fraction of the main puzzle on the hub. Hub 2 evolves the themed keys so that instead of using the keys in specific environments, we will be using the keys for specific doors scattered across the maps. We're taught that we're still searching for switches that each solve a part of the main puzzle, but here in the hub, we see portraits that tell us which switches we found, which enable us to figure out which areas we still need to investigate in order to solve the puzzle. Hub 3 does away with the themed keys and introduces the concept of context-based items, which, when used in a specific place, solves a puzzle that enables us to progress. We again have to find multiple switches to solve the final puzzle, but these are much easier to discover this time, since it's the last time we're going to be doing this kind of switch hunting. Hub 4. Now we're primarily focusing on context-based items for solving puzzles across the hub, with only 2 themed keys and a lack of multiple switches to solve the main puzzle. While the density of combat certainly escalated in the previous hub, here we encounter the most number of combatants in the midst of attempting to solve puzzles and manipulate the environment. Hub 5. We're only required to find 3 context-based items in order to unlock the door that leads us to the epilogue, while mostly focusing on combat. The hub is teeming with respawning enemies, each of the 3 tombs is a full assault, and we have left the complex puzzle system fully behind in order to focus on wading through the hordes. Epilogue. It's one big fight against the final boss. No keys, no context items, just waves of enemies and our own determination to see the day through. As we move forward from beginning to end, it is a clear rise and fall from simplicity to the most complex and devious puzzle design in the entire game, and then afterwards slowly descales into fewer puzzles and more emphasis on survival. In the prologue, we only have a few enemies to fight, and by the epilogue, we are up to our elbows in fodder enemies as we circle strafe around the Serpent Rider. While Hub 4 is the most dense in terms of context-based items and clues, Hub 3 is the apex and most balanced in terms of the puzzles that Hexen asks us to weather. Navigating the interior of the Heresiarch Seminary, searching for the planetary gemstones, we manipulate the environment utilizing the context-based items, and afterwards, we're then off to hunt down the 9 switches necessary for the Heresiarch to appear. All the while, we are practically assaulted left and right by monsters and mayhem, a real escalation in combat from the previous 2 hubs. Hell, the Seminary opens up with our character outside the chapel, fighting their way inside and being forced into a melee in the dark before the game's scripting lights the braziers that line the chapel and we're finally able to see our foes for a fair fight. Even as the puzzles and solutions and environmental scripting evolve over time, so too does the amount of sheer bloody combat that we have to engage with. Eventually, the puzzles slowly de-escalate into simpler item hunting quests, and we're asked by the end to rely on the weapons and items we've built up over time, which has, in a way, leveled up our character into a persuasively powerful combatant. Okay, I get what you're thinking. All of this sounds way too convoluted for a first-person shooter. And in some ways, yeah, you're right. Hexen, as a straightforward first-person shooter experience, doesn't work for a player coming in hot off the heels of, say, Doom. Even if you're coming right in after the experience of Heretic and want to jump into this afterward, there's still a strong chance the average player might get bounced out of Hexen, because Heretic falls more in line with traditional FPS gameplay, with weapons and map design meant to empower and enable the player to experience a power fantasy. Here in Hexen, the experience is a kind of a hybrid of gameplay. The combat and level progression are more in line with a dungeon crawler, in which your character starts out weak and barely survives by the skin of their teeth, slowly gathering more and more weapons in service of facing bigger demons and larger hordes of monsters. Meanwhile, the puzzle and exploration component of Hexen falls more in line with a point-and-click adventure game. In that genre, you're asked to thoroughly explore your environment, consider every item you find, move back and forth between maps in order to discover both changes in the world and also solve puzzles that exist on one end of the map or the other. Sure, point-and-click adventures do sometimes rely on moon logic, requiring items and combinations thereof that are so strange and weird that it would take a madman to figure it out. But the point of those games is to stop and think about the task at hand, the problem you face, and how you can affect that with the options in your inventory. Hexen combines FPS mechanics with dungeon crawler gameplay design and point-and-click adventure puzzles. Over time, it turns more and more into a bloodbath, but it tests the player's mind constantly in order to reach that point. I love this. I love Hexen. I love how intentional the design is here. Purposefully convoluted, but with a method to the madness. While some might disagree with this next statement, there isn't an ounce of filler here. Sure, I could see an argument made for the secret levels being unnecessary, and sure, if you don't feel like stocking up on extra icons or craters, they are a little superfluous. I would also argue that most secret levels in any FPS game are superfluous as well, but the factor that makes the secret levels in Hexen essential are those extra powerful rewards. Sure, it's a risk. You're probably expending precious mana and quartz flasks to top up your health just to journey through these secret levels, but they exist on the dungeon crawler layer of gameplay. Put in the work to find the secret areas and be rewarded with items that you'll absolutely want and need for future questing. Okay, so you kids are probably looking at me like, Dad, we hear you, but this game sounds tough as hell, complicated as shit, and not very enjoyable. And you know what? That's actually kind of hard to argue with. Hexen, much like Korax in the same way, is actively working against you even as it provides you with slow and subtle guides for how to beat it. It teaches you how to play the game, but it also dares you to try and complete it. It does, in fact, reward you for paying attention, but it also loves to play tricks on you just when you think you understand how it works. And if that was all there was to Hexen, I would probably still love this game. Not as much as I actually do, but I would still very much enjoy a game that is not meant to be enjoyable. Sure, it's designed to be played, but Dark Souls isn't exactly designed to be enjoyable either. It's designed to be rewarding when you conquer that which prevents you from moving forward, when you understand what you need to do, and when you are able to overcome the odds against you. It is rewarding. Not enjoyable, but rewarding. So too is Hexen. It's designed to be challenging, frustrating, and ultimately rewarding, but not necessarily designed to be enjoyable. There is, however, a method to all of this madness. A further layer, or maybe I should say, a further 3 layers for us to take in outside of the base experience. Because the base experience doesn't change depending on the class you play as, but your experience and perspective of it will. See, the depth of Hexen's intentional design can really only be understood if you play the game as more than one class. You kids might all have your personal favorite class, but the real meat and potatoes of Hexen lie in understanding how all of these classes differ and how those differences impact the experience of the game. Now you might be thinking, just how much does the experience of Hexen change from class to class? It can't really be that much, can it? Well, as mentioned earlier, yes, it really fucking can. So each class is going to find themselves with a single starter weapon, a weapon that uses no mana. As they progress, it will collect 3 more weapons throughout the course of the game. One weapon that uses blue mana, one weapon that uses green mana, and a super weapon that draws from both mana pools. While the blue and green mana weapons are located in specific hubs for each class, the super weapon must be constructed over time, using 3 individual pieces found across the hubs. The first piece is found at the end of the 7 portals, while the other pieces are in different locations depending on the class you've chosen. Each weapon has different uses and attacks, each weapon has different damage numbers, each weapon uses different amounts of mana, you get the drift here. Now, outside of weapons, each character has different baseline stats, of which they are speed, armor, magic, and strength. Each class is also going to utilize the different pieces of armor you can find in the game differently, meaning that some classes are going to benefit more from certain pieces of armor, while others will not. Each class also uses an inventory item called fleshets differently, and while each of them will cause damage to enemies, their effects vary from class to class. So going into the game and understanding that, you would be forgiven for looking at your class choices, making an informed decision based on your own personal gameplay style, and roll into the game with a straightforward mindset. Of course, once you reach the endgame, you'd have a certain perspective on Hexen's experience, and depending on who you picked, it might be more or less positive than with other classes. It's still the same game, but the perspective is vastly different due to the balancing, and also to how the game reacts to your character's impact. Alright, so since I played through this 3 times, once as each class, I'm going to go through the experience of each one to illustrate these points. And we're going to start with the class I played as first, the Fighter. I have a strong feeling that the Fighter is probably the way most people played this game on their first time through. He's really got the juice, too. Speed is 10, armor's 10, magic is a 1, and strength is 10. Long story short, the Fighter is a walking, talking tank of a human who doesn't have time for names and faces. Only the fight and the fight alone. Just from a starting perspective, if you want to take the least amount of damage and deal the most back out at your foes, Baratus the Fighter is going to be your man. Now, if we look down here at the HUD, we're going to notice our AC, or armor class. The Fighter starts off with an AC of 3, the highest starting AC of the 3 classes. This is important to note because each point of AC reduces all incoming damage by 5%. There are 4 pieces of armor the player can find in Hexen, and here's how they affect the Fighter. Mesh armor adds 5 AC points, Falcon Shield adds 4 points, Platinum Helm adds 3 points, and the Amulet of Warding, a magical item, adds only 1 point. There's also a consumable inventory item called the Dragon Skin Bracers, which will temporarily add 4 points of armor to the player no matter what class they're using. If, as a fighter, you can find a way to grab all the pieces of armor, you can have a potential AC of 16, and if you use the Dragon Skin Bracers at the same time, you'll temporarily top out at 20. The way the Fighter uses the fleshets is pretty straightforward. He tosses them like grenades. Apparently, according to the game, since Baratus has little to no knowledge of magical items, the fleshets behave this way because he's just a straightforward grunt. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. But his fleshets will either explode on contact with an enemy, or they will bounce around a few times and then explode after a couple of seconds. The downside, however, is that enemies who can reflect attacks, namely the centaurs and the Heresiarch, will deflect the fleshets away harmlessly, which could lead to the Fighter getting his own explosion back in his face. As you'd expect, the Fighter is, well, a fighter. Through and through, so most of his attacks are going to be based around melee instead of range. And what ranged weapons he does get to utilize aren't nearly as helpful as the ranged weapons used by the other 2 classes. Let's look at the Fighter's opening weapon, the Spiked Gauntlets. They're actually unique not just to the Fighter, but also in their method of attack, in that they have damage that builds up over each successive hit. Where other weapons do a specific amount of damage with each blast, the gauntlets attack in a 3-hit combo with 2 normal punches and then a 3rd stronger punch. The normal punches land for 40 to 50 points of damage each, while the stronger punch lands for 80 to 100. If you hit all 3 in a row, the strong punch will land for 100 points guaranteed, meaning you've just done around 200 points of damage, which will kill most of the monsters in the game. And this is your fucking starting weapon. Now, of course, the 3-hit windup can take a second and isn't as quick as the other weapons. So let's take a look now at the fighter's blue weapon, Timon's Axe.
Bad things happen, and you can't do anything about it.
Timon's Axe, much like the gauntlets, is primarily designed for melee use, but when the fighter has a blue mana pool to draw from, it supercharges and does even more damage. I want to take a quick second to note right here that the fighter's blue and green mana weapons are the only weapons in the game where, if you happen to run out of mana, are still useful and viable weapons just because of their melee nature. You can still use them and attack with them without mana, they just won't be as powerful. For example, Timon's Axe does 35 to 50 points of damage without mana, and 80 to 120 points of damage with mana. It also uses only 2 mana per hit, not just per attack. A lot of weapons in the game need mana just to even fire, but the axe here only uses mana when you land a hit on a monster. Swing and a miss, no harm, no foul, no mana used. From that perspective alone, it is one of the most economical weapons in the entire game, if not the most. Considering you can top your mana pool out at 200 points, that's 100 attacks you can land in a row with this thing if you don't pick up any more mana along the way. And considering that blue mana is probably the most plentiful to find, you're gonna be doing just fine on resources while using this one. 2 quick swings from this bad boy will put down almost any enemy, including the centaurs. So without question, you're gonna want to keep it handy when you're fighting groups. Taking out centaurs and slaughtars is going to be our #1 priority when it comes to combat in this game, with the Dark Bishops coming in at a very close second. Centaurs and slaughtars, as we've seen, block attacks with their shields and also reflect incoming projectiles back at the player. The axe's melee nature negates any reflection, and since it's only 2 blue mana per hit, you can even afford to let them block some of your attacks as you swing away like a madman, waiting for them to drop their shields. The green mana weapon is the Hammer of Retribution, which is fuck. That's the perfect fucking name for this one because it absolutely feels like you're ripping these monsters a brand new one for daring to stand in your way. Just like the axe, the Hammer of Retribution can be used as a melee option if you have no green mana, doing 60 to 120 damage just by itself. But if you do have green mana, the hammer throws out a magic missile in the shape of a spinning, flaming hammer, smashing things apart with 80 to 160 points of damage per missile, and an additional 25 to 50 points of splash damage for the resulting explosion when and where it lands. Even if you miss with the missile, that blast radius sure can help take out 1 or 2 enemies nearby. All of this for the low cost of only 3 mana per swing. And, as a lovely little bonus, not only is the fighter immune to the splash damage from the hammer's explosion, but if you're within melee range of an enemy, the hammer will automatically switch into non-powered melee mode without costing any mana to do so. The hammer friggin' rips. It's powerful, it hits multiple enemies, it can one-shot most lower tier enemies, and the only downside is that, as a ranged attack, the projectile is just a little slow. Trying to time the speed on that spinning hammer can be a bit tricky when you're compensating for the flight patterns of Afrits, Dark Bishops, and the Death Wyvern, and you do want to be careful tossing these at centaurs because it really isn't fun when they reflect your hammer back at you. But when you consider how economical both the axe and hammer are, hardly using any mana at all with a big return on heavy damage, it's easy to see how playing as the fighter is, in a lot of ways, playing Hexen on easy mode. Of course, we still need to discuss the fighter's ultimate weapon, the Quietus. A massive sword smothered in green flames, the Quietus has no melee option. Instead, it throws 5 magic fireballs through the air, spreading out over distance, with the fireballs landing for 100 to 150 points of damage each. Now, at point blank range, Quietus is a one-shot kill for everything except bosses. At a distance, it feels really difficult to land a proper hit with multiple fireballs, usually missing at least 1 or 2. And considering the fact that it costs 14 blue mana and 14 green mana per swing, every fireball that doesn't land is a costly miss. Then again, spending 14 from each mana pool just to get up close for 1 swing also feels just a little too costly. Quietus is a powerful weapon, and a fine one for when you're in a pinch. It's just a bit of a letdown for an ultimate weapon when we consider how the fighter's other weapons, the gauntlets, the axe, the hammer, all escalate in terms of damage output and frequency of use. Quietus is the nuclear option, best used only against bosses and heavy groups. But when we consider the fact that the Heresiarch appears as a boss twice, and that he can reflect the Quietus's fireballs, the Quietus is best reserved for when you're either overwhelmed by large groups, or for Korax himself. Well, okay, and the 3 corrupted leaders in the 5th hub. Quietus does a pretty decent job corralling those bosses as well. Otherwise, the fighter's other weapons are so much better just on the whole. So let's recap. The fighter has the highest potential armor class out of everyone in the game, does the most amount of damage with his weapons while taking the least amount of damage from enemies, and economically has the best weapons in the game. Playing as the fighter, it's hard to not rip and tear through the entirety of the experience. He's only really weak against enemies that fly due to his melee-focused nature, but the hammer does help in that regard. The only thing holding him back from being obscenely powerful is, oddly enough, the Quietus. When it comes to final slot weapons in FPS games, us gamers have come to expect armament on the destructive scale of the BFG 9000. And rightly so. Spending most of a game utilizing and swapping between multiple weapons of various damage percentages, having a final weapon that absolutely destroys everything in the room is essential to the experience. And Quietus doesn't live up to that. It just costs too much mana to use a weapon this underwhelming. However, when the fighter's blue and green weapons are as good as they are, ultimately, being let down by Quietus doesn't hurt this class quite as much as it frankly should. The first time I played through Hexen, I played as a cleric. I naturally lean towards characters that are more quote-unquote balanced. I don't want to lean too heavy on any one particular skill set. I don't want to be too melee focused. I want to have variety, options, the ability to play with a little more flair. Well, the cleric is certainly that option when it comes to players who don't want to feel like they have it too easy or too rough. Although it's going to cost you in the long run. From a stats perspective, the cleric is already much different from the fighter. Speed 7, armor 8, magic 6, and strength 6. Fucking yikes. That is a big goddamn gap in stats when you put them side by side. Of course, the cleric has a few tricks to help level the playing field. Armor-wise, Parias will receive 5 armor from the Falcon Shield, 4 armor from the Amulet of Warding, that tricksy magical armor item, 2 armor from the Mesh Armor, and 1 armor from the Platinum Helm. That brings him up to a total potential 14 AC, 18 if you use the Dragonskin Bracers. Since the cleric is a bit more wise in the ways of magic and shit, the way he uses the fleshets is decidedly more interesting, and even a bit roguish. Dropping a fleshet on the ground causes it to explode a moment later, not bursting into flame, but instead billowing into a cloud of poison gas. This gas hangs around in the air for, honestly, a lot longer than I wish it would. Because if you happen to drop one and don't have the wiggle room to move around it, you're either going to have to sit and wait a while for it to disperse, or just eat the poison damage it'll do to you and walk on through. But here's what's great about the cleric's fleshets. They cut right through the Centaur and Slaughtar's shields. Yes, the poison isn't incredibly high in damage, but it does do damage over time, and Centaurs stop to try and block the damage, meaning they're caught in the cloud and they stay inside of it. Other enemies can and will escape the cloud and come through to get you, so stay on your toes in that regard. But one fleshet, timed and dropped in the right place, can kill 2 or even 3 centaurs in one shot. Hell, even the Heresiarch is unable to block the poison damage, so when you're fighting him as the cleric, all you have to do is activate an icon of the defender, circle strafe, and drop a bunch of fleshets, and within seconds the boss is dead and you get to move on. Shit like this overpowered nonsense, almost makes up for the cleric's weaknesses. Almost. Let's start with the Mace of Contrition, the cleric's starter weapon. It is the worst. It is the absolute. It is the goddamn. The mace hits for 25 to 40 damage per swing. And to give you an idea of just how much of a decline we're talking in the strength department, where the fighter's gauntlets basically took down Ettins in 3 rapid hits, the mace takes 6 solid swings in a row to take down 1 Ettin. 6 fucking hits. This is not a good weapon. By and large, the mace is regarded as the weakest and worst weapon in the whole of Hexen and even Heretic. A bastard with no place in this or any other game, and yet, somehow, this is the starting weapon for what the game considers the balanced class. It's really difficult in any capacity to take this weapon seriously. And what makes it even worse is that the next weapon on the cleric's call sheet is buried within the Guardian of Steel on higher difficulty levels. So depending on how you progress through the 7 portals, you might be stuck with this weapon for a hot second. And against centaurs, that's a hot second too long. Thankfully, once we find the Serpent Staff, oh boy, do things start to turn around for our boy Parias. The Serpent Staff is just a chef's kiss of a weapon. Fucking chef's kiss. Requiring only 1 blue mana per shot, the staff fires twin green projectiles that wind in an S pattern, and depending on the range, will land for 10 to 35 points of damage each. Meanwhile, if you're up close and personal in melee range, the staff will switch over into a secondary fire mode, which does 20 to 30 points of damage per hit and also drains health from the enemy you're attacking, filling up the cleric's own HP in the process. 2 HP per hit right back to you. It cannot be overstated how fucking invaluable this is. Absolutely fucking invaluable. Considering that the cleric isn't as beefy as the fighter, we're already seeing a bit of a drain on our resources staying alive. The Serpent Staff is not only a godsend in the sense that we're suddenly killing things quickly after being forced to impotently club away with the mace, but refilling our health? 5-star weapon. The Serpent Staff stays viable throughout the whole of the game, but you do need to be careful trying to get up close to centaurs, because even at melee range, their shields will treat the drain as a projectile and reflect it back onto you. Now, while that upgrade from mace to staff is a nice one, don't expect similar treatment with our green mana weapon. This is a magic spell, the Firestorm. The cleric essentially casts a stream of fire from his hands to land burning damage on whatever it touches. Damage lands for 80 to 100 points, and the flames last for a couple of seconds, continuing to burn whatever it touches. Some higher tier enemies, like the Chaos Serpents and the Dark Bishops, can even be one-shot by the Firestorm depending on the RNG. Centaurs and Slottars are also going to feel the burn from this one, as it lands a heavier blow than the Serpent Staff does, and the flames can't be reflected. However, they can be partially blocked. Firestorm represents one of the fastest ways to take out all enemies, including the centaurs, but at 4 green mana per shot, it's potentially a costly strike against those shielded bastards. The cleric's Firestorm and Fleshette use represent 2 opposite sides of the same coin in regards to centaurs. Firestorm takes him out faster, but with a heavier mana drain. The Fleshette takes him out in pretty much 1 item use, but the cloud lasts forever and could block you in if you don't want to take damage. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, compares to the cleric's ultimate weapon, the beastly, the holy, the divine intervention itself. Kids of all ages, I present to you the Wraith Verge. Absolutely devastating. With a cost of 8 blue mana and 18 green mana per blast, the Wraith Verge unleashes the souls of the dead upon whoever it hits, and there is absolutely no mercy involved. You're pretty much carrying around a BFG, if the BFG was the Ark of the Covenant. Now, yes, it should be recognized that the weapon is a little costly in terms of mana drain, especially those 18 points of green mana versus the 8 points of blue mana. And no, this is not a one-shot room cleaning machine either. Depending on the size and scope of the enemies in front of you, you're gonna have to let loose at least 2, maybe 3 shots to devastate an entire room. And one final precaution. If you happen to fire the Wraith Verge at something that can reflect back at you, if you get hit with the blast, then all those angry souls are gonna swarm around you and drag you to hell instead of your enemies. Fortunately, I never experienced this myself, but I've heard horror stories from other gamers, and those stories are gruesome. Wraith Verge, pound for pound, damage point for damage point, is easily the single best weapon in the game. It'll take out bosses and crowds and will absolutely decimate centaurs and slottars. Like, they are wet paper in the face of the Wraith Verge. It makes the final fight against Korax an absolute joke. This weapon is just that good, which then is the true balance behind our balanced character class here. Yes, in the beginning, the cleric really struggles to stay afloat. Low damage numbers due to the mace, not nearly as resilient as the fighter, and the Fleshettes can be a pain to work around even though they are one of the cleric's best options against the centaurs. But the Serpent Staff's usefulness throughout the whole of the game, the way it leeches health back to the player, and the Firestorm's high damage output can and will carry players who choose this class through to the endgame. But it's the Wraith Verge that is the true prize at the end of this rainbow. A stunning, glorious, triumphant fuck you to everything that has stood in your way thus far and upcoming. A weapon that you should absolutely spam and overuse and cackle the entire time you're doing so. Playing as the Cleric is one of the most difficult and sloggy ways to play Hexen, at least through the first couple of hubs. I'm honestly a little shocked that I enjoyed playing this game as much as I did when I chose the Cleric the first time I played it, because this class is pretty much playing the game on hard mode. It eventually and ultimately becomes the most rewarding class by the end, but you'll be gritting your teeth and cursing the design of this game until you get there. So I saved the Mage for last as a part of this video because, well, frankly, magic users are not my favorite classes in the fantasy games that I like to play. Like I mentioned above with the Cleric, I want to have a little variety. Maybe just from looks and presentation alone, the Fighter would seem to me a bit too meaty for my tastes, and the Mage would be a little too fragile. After all, his stats definitely reflect that. Speed 4, Armor 2, Magic 10, Strength 4. The Mage is going to get beat up and bruised far, far too quickly if you're not paying attention and keeping your distance from enemies in combat. Now, up till this character, I hadn't really addressed the speed stat, as it kind of didn't really need addressing. Both the Fighter and the Cleric move at a decent clip, and even though the Fighter is definitely a step quicker, there really isn't enough difference between those two to warrant a discussion. But the Mage is definitely slower. Slower to the point where certain jumps, even at full speed, are either going to be supremely difficult for Daedolon, or just straight up impossible. In the Heresiarch Seminary, there's a jump you need to make in order to wind your way around and find one of the planetary gemstones. I made it real easy with the Fighter, made it easy with the Cleric, but the Mage... Yeah, that was a rough go for a second. I couldn't figure out why in that moment I was having such a hard time. In hindsight, yeah, the Mage's speed stat will for sure affect your gameplay in certain places. His AC rating isn't all that great either. Amulet of Warding gives 5 AC points. Falcon Shield, 3 points. Platinum Helm, 2 points. Mesh Armor, 1 point. Totaling up to a potential rating of 12 if you can collect them all at once, and 16 if you have the dragon skin bracers as well. So he's slow. His defenses are low. His magic is crazy high, like as high as it can go, but his strength isn't all that great either. Just based on appearances, we are not off to a great start. However, things start to turn around when we consider how fleshits work for him. When used, the Mage's fleshits will drop on the ground, and after a split second, will explode for massive damage. Much like the Cleric's gas bombs, these explosions will cut through the reflective defenses of the Centaurs and the Heresiarch, meaning if you're surrounded by those shield-wielding bastards, dropping a bunch of these will do you nicely. However, if you don't back out of the way quickly, you're gonna get caught in the blast yourself, so stay sharp. All that said, now we get to dive into the Mage's weapons, and boy, howdy! Is this a treat for us, kids? The starting weapon, the Sapphire Wand, is first of all the only ranged weapon in the game that doesn't require mana. Each hit lands for 24 to 36 points of damage, which puts it right about the same damage output as the Cleric's mace. Alright, so if we have to land the same number of hits with this as we do the mace, which is objectively the shittiest weapon in the game, why is this weapon so exciting then? Because the Sapphire Wand's bolts act kind of like railgun slugs. The attack is near instantaneous, crossing the length of the screen in a straight line so fast that it's practically a hit scan weapon, and each bolt travels through the enemy you're attacking. So if you've done the smart thing and lined up 2, 3, hell, even 4 enemies in your line of sight, with the Sapphire Wand, you are potentially attacking all 4 of them at the same time. Lower damage output, but higher kill rate than the other starting weapons. The wand is viable from beginning to end. Anytime you're in a narrow hallway, facing down Ettins, Afrits, Dark Bishop, doesn't matter. Whip out the wand, start blasting, and you're hacking away at everything lined up in front of you all at once. Centaurs might be able to block the damage from the wand, but the shot will still travel right through them and hit whatever is behind them. So you can fire away to your heart's content and not worry about anything reflecting back your way. Up next, we have the blue mana weapon for the Mage, a spell called Frost Shard. The Mage casts a slew of ice shards that fly through the air, spreading out over distance. Each shard is going to hit for 3 to 5 points of damage each, meaning you're going to want to be as close as possible to hit with each spread. Think of this as the shotgun of the Hexen universe. Up close, the spell changes to a melee attack that hits real hard at 90 odd points of damage. All of this for the low cost of 3 points of blue mana per attack. But the unique aspect of Frost Shard is that once you've done enough damage, instead of killing an enemy outright, this spell will literally freeze them into an ice sculpture. Now, on the ground, this can be a bit of a double-edged sword. Sure, you've frozen your target, they're done for, and if any enemy attacks come floating your way, the newly frozen popsicle will block that incoming damage, or even block enemies from having a clear path to get to you directly. On the other hand, this frozen enemy can and will block your attacks, and will block your path as well. If you're trying to continually use the Frost Shard, all you'll end up doing is hitting a frozen enemy with more freezing shards. So if you want to shatter the ice, you have to switch to something like the Wand, shatter them for yourself, and then switch back to the Frost Shard. While the Frost Shard can definitely be useful when it comes to literally stopping enemies in their tracks, this whole dance of swapping back and forth between the shards and a different weapon to break the ice can sometimes be a huge pain, especially if you're getting trapped in areas you don't want to be trapped in. On the plus side though, if you use Frost Shard on flying enemies, which is what I like to do, when the enemy freezes, they will plummet from the sky and shatter on impact, which is not only hilarious, but a lot of fun to pull off. The mage's green mana weapon though, the Arc of Death, oh man, does this shit friggin' rip! The mage casts a spell of electricity between his hands and then tosses it out like a lightning cloud, zipping through the air until it lands on an enemy and begins to electrocute them from above and below. It'll hold the enemy in place for a random number of seconds, doing around 150 points of damage per second. It costs 5 green mana to cast and will completely rip through the centaur shields. Of course, RNG means that sometimes the arc doesn't hang around long enough to kill a centaur in one shot, but the times that it does is so satisfying that literally every other weakness the mage has is completely forgotten. I remember when I first got this weapon, and I gave it a try on the centaurs. I was cackling, howling. What a great fucking weapon this is. Centaurs and slaughters are nothing in the face of this attack. The Heresiarch too. Imagine yourself circle strafing the Heresiarch, laying down fleshets and filling the air with electricity, nailing that bastard down in seconds. Arc of Death is, hands down, one of the most satisfying weapons to utilize in the game. Top 3, I would say. Which then brings us to Daedalon's ultimate weapon, the Blood Scourge. It costs 15 blue and 15 green mana to fire, and when you do, it shoots out 2 homing fireballs that do 125 points of damage each. They will tear straight through most enemies and will zip around until they land on a final target and then explode. This is another room cleaner and centaur killer. Watching clouds of centaurs just fall to literal pieces as these fireballs cut right through them, circling back around if their shields are still up. Man, this is a joy. It's not quite as powerful as the Wraithforge, nor does it clear a room with the same amount of efficiency, and yes, those fireballs can be reflected. Also, while the explosion when the fireballs land is certainly more devastating as a single attack, the fireballs don't always go where you want them to. They've kind of got a mind of their own, and when we're using this on single targets, it feels a little inaccurate. Okay, so we have 3 distinct classes, each with distinct weapons and experiences, and now we can really start to see the intentional and methodical design of Hexen. Each class has their own struggles, but then each class also finds a way to make up for that. The Fighter is going to clear through pretty much everything in the game except flying creatures with relative ease. The Cleric will be able to maintain his health with the Serpent Staff, but struggle overall to do a lot of damage quickly until he gets the overpowered Wraithforge. And the Mage is going to struggle to hold on to health items in his inventory because of how much damage he takes, despite arguably doing the most amount of damage output against every variety of enemy in the game. After playing Hexen the first time, I had pretty much one thought. Fuck the centaurs. I hate them. I think that they're just absolutely bonkers in terms of enemy design. Just really fucking disgustingly frustrating. This was after playing through the game as a cleric, having stumbled and struggled and used so many fleshets and stood around waiting, endlessly waiting for them to drop their shields so I could finally get the best of them and move onwards. What's even worse about these enemies isn't that there's the slaughter variation. That's just a matter of having to stay mobile even when you think you don't need to. No, what's truly insidious about the centaurs is just how many the game begins to continuously throw at you the deeper you get into the campaign. At one point, playing through Zedek's tomb in the Necropolis, it felt like I had somehow left Hexen behind and entered a realm called Oops All Centaurs. Playing as the cleric, these things suck to fight. They just fucking suck. No matter how you roll the dice, without the Wraithforge and enough mana to keep it topped up, fighting centaurs as the cleric sucks. And for a while, for the life of me, I couldn't understand the thought process behind the design of such an insidious beast. They are, for lack of a better comparison, the Marauders of Hexen. They move around, they raise their shields when attacked, and you have to think very precisely and engage strategically with them when in the midst of combat. Of course, thinking about it that way made me come to the realization that these enemies aren't just frustratingly designed, they're designed to be frustrating. Every enemy and every map and every item here in Hexen has a specific intention behind it. As we journey through the game, common and uncommon items will all spawn where they're supposed to. Enemies spawn where they're supposed to. The only changes to the gameplay are based on the difficulty setting and which class we chose. So despite each class gaining different benefits to different pieces of armor, we're going to find specific pieces of armor placed in specific spots on specific maps, because that is how the game is built. It's up to us to react accordingly to gaining either 1 or 5 points of armor. So too are we asked to adapt to the choices we've made as the class we are when facing certain enemies. The game isn't interested in making this easy on us, or indulging us in a power fantasy. Each character is eventually granted the ability to overcome the centaurs and slaughters at a point during the gameplay. For the fighter, this happens early on. Timon's axe can 2-hit a centaur, and so will the hammer from afar if timed right. For the cleric, this comes somewhat with the firestorm, but primarily with the wraith verge. For the mage, this comes with the Arc of Death spell. Part of the dungeon crawler aspect of Hexen is that enemies are obstacles, not just targets for you to paint the walls red with. While every enemy has their own set of rules and movements and weaknesses, the centaurs and slaughters represent the game's fundamental focus on strategically approaching your opponents. So too does the design of the stalkers, who can only be damaged when they emerge from the water to attack the player. But centaurs ask us to consider our options, how we can use them, and remind us just how limited we are in our freedom of combat. They also serve as an excellent example of the balancing of the game overall, in how the game doesn't treat the character classes equally, but provides options for each class in different ways for their own individual progression. Maybe this is something that just exists in games like Diablo or Baldur's Gate, or in other CRPG games where the point of combat is to not have an exciting fit of player agency and power fantasy, but to instead exist as action puzzles and obstacles to overcome in the grand scheme of the campaign. I don't play enough CRPG games, that playstyle is not for me, but I do respect their design, how they ask the gamer to stop and consider what tasks they're going to undergo, the difficulties each class presents. Mass Effect is very similar in this regard. I've played the second game so many times, once as each class, and it is stunning how well that game provides options and balance and a different experience for each class, and yet the presentation and enemy design and placement are all the same regardless of the player's choice. Raven really did put those RPG elements to work here in Hexen. Sure, we don't have the traditional level up system, no experience points or skills to gain through progression, but the core systems are in place. A world that is hostile, aggravated, unyielding to those who simply want to just wade through and cleave their foes in half. Sure, the fighter comes real close to that mindset and has the easiest time of the 3 classes in terms of steady progression, but even still, the puzzles and switch hunting remain in place, defying even those who think that they can just plow their way through the campaign and be done with it. So with all that said, is there, from a player's perspective, one class that is the best to play as, or maybe the worst to play as? With a game like this, where everything is so intentional, it's hard to subjectively say which is objectively best or worst. However, since they're so finely tuned to have pros and cons within the structure of the game mechanics, I think I can at least classify each of the character classes by the experience you want to have. The fighter is, hands down, the easiest class to play with. You're going to have the most straightforward time with the fighter's high strength, speed, and armor, and even the fair to middling ranged attacks of the hammer and the quietest don't really hamper the experience of the fighter. This is your option for wading in straight away without having to think too much about how you're going to approach the game. The mage, on the other hand, is the best class to play as. Despite his physical weaknesses, the mage, just pound for pound, attack for attack, is a bona fide force of nature. The fighter might do more damage per single attack and thusly removes monsters from the board quicker when you factor in the insane number of enemies you can hit with the mage's wand in just one shot, the versatility of the frost shards, the insane destruction of the Arc of Death, and the homing missiles of the Blood Scourge. The mage is going to be clearing out entire waves of monsters at a time versus the fighter's one-on-one approach. Staying alive is much more tricky. You'll be consuming quartz flasks for health constantly, and will have to fight to find more. Staying topped up on mana might be more difficult than other classes too, but the mage is by far the best way to play this game from the sheer feeling of destructive power. That leaves the cleric. Parias, my boy. The cleric is, hands down, the most difficult way to play Hexen. He starts out weak. He's constantly struggling against the centaurs until the Wraith Verge appears, but over time, he slowly but steadily becomes the most rewarding class to play as. Couple an icon of the Defender with a couple of Craters of Might and the Wraith Verge in your hands, suddenly, without any warning, the Cleric is now the most unstoppable character in the entire game. Add in the ability to leech life from monsters with the staff, and the Cleric is also the most stubbornly resilient. But those first couple of hubs are going to be a chore, demanding much from players who may or may not have played the game before, forcing them to pay close attention to the environments, the monsters, their inventory, fervently pushing forward as the game feels like it is unfairly pushing back. And yet, with all of that noted, I feel like the Cleric's experience is the intended experience of Hexen. Trust me, you want to play as a Cleric, if only even once, just to feel the cold touch of indifference as the game ignores your frustration and your pleas for things to lighten up, to then move past that, beyond that sensation, into the domain of the truly legendary players who have grasped the mace and lived to tell the tale. By the end of the game, having played as a Cleric, I felt like I could tackle anything the game wanted to throw at me, and by that point, I absolutely could. Hexen is a masterclass of design. It asks the player to invest just as much of their time into the game as the devs have. The class system, the puzzle design, the environmental and AI scripting, all of this comes together in a single cohesive whole that refuses to compromise. Over on Twitter, I said that if Heretic is Fantasy Doom, then Heretic is Fantasy Doom Eternal. You have to consider the battlefield. You have to consider your resources. You have to consider the construction of the game in front of you and the way that enemies work, or you will just die over and over again. And you will get frustrated, and you will probably walk away unsatisfied. Is Hexen a perfect game? No, not really. While I can't find any flaws in the enemies or the level design or the logic behind the puzzles themselves, the complex scripting systems do sometimes get in their own way and can actually be far too easy to break the game without meaning to. For example, in the axe room at the top of the Castle of Grief, before you face the Heresiarch for the second time, there's a famous bug that was just simply never addressed. After defeating the Afrits floating around the room, a group of 4 Chaos Serpents will appear on the throne in the middle of the room. If you defeat them too quickly, the game's scripting will break, and the walls that are supposed to drop to release Dark Bishops into the area will not activate. And if the Dark Bishops don't appear, then you can't defeat them to open up the back of the throne room to get to the Heresiarch. This happened to me with both the Cleric and the Mage. I had to run around and count to 10 real slow before taking out the Chaos Serpents just to make sure that I didn't trigger the bug. Of course, thanks to modern solutions, there are ways to get around this and other script issues that the game has. Occasionally, a script just won't run, and the complex sequence of events needed to run in the background in order to progress the game forward doesn't happen. They're very rare, few and far between, I would say, but the bug in the axe room is the most prominent and the most well known. And frankly, it's kind of a sin that it even still exists in the game. Still, even with that in mind, Hexen scores a 10 out of 10. Which of course begs the question, if there are parts of the game that can be broken still, scripting bugs and the like, why is the game still getting a 10 out of 10? Don't flaws in the game mean the game shouldn't get a perfect score? I had a conversation along these lines recently about awarding scores to games and movies and other media, and whether or not anything should receive a so-called perfect score. In my view, there isn't a single piece of media that is truly perfect. Every movie, album, novel, every single one of them had some kind of flaw or imperfection. It's human nature. As imperfect beings, we create imperfect things. But when it comes to media, or really, art and entertainment, we have to consider how well the impact of the media distracted us from its flaws. Hexen is a game that is so intricately constructed, presented with such intentional precision, that it is perhaps inevitable that aspects will just not work. Perhaps aspects of it just won't work for the player. Perhaps technological aspects won't work and the game will break a little. Considering how much of the game does work, how much of it works on so many different layers, across different layers, and how few and far between those breakdowns are, I just can't find fault with the game. We're fucking PC gamers. We break games intentionally and take advantage of systems for breakfast. I got the Heresiarch stuck on the lava pentagram while facing it as the fighter and went to town laughing the whole way. Moments like these are what we live for. So if the game is good enough that we can live with breaking the game in our favor, then sometimes, if the game breaks against us, not egregiously, mind you, just sometimes, here and there, then I think we can have a little grace with that too. Hexen, again, is a masterclass of design, of pacing, of layering, of crafting a dense campaign that pushes back against the player with every turn. The game is designed to be frustrating so that we might find our fraught victories ultimately rewarding. And after navigating all of this 3 times in a row, I can't help but take off my hat and stand with respect for a game that is nothing short of a masterpiece. Hexen is a 10 out of 10. Oh, thank God I finally managed to slog my way through all of that. Okay, now I just need to edit this bitch down and we'll have a video. Not so fast, young man. Did you just call me young man? I'm you from the future. You're young to me. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Aren't you forgetting something? No, I don't think so. I covered everything I wanted to cover with this video. If I keep going at this point, it'll just be redundant. You sure you're not forgetting something? Oh, hell no. I already said I wasn't doing expansions for the History series. I even specifically mentioned Deathkings as something that I wouldn't be covering. Oh, come on. You know you're not going to sit well with it if you don't. Nope, I said I wasn't doing expansions. I'm not doing expansions. You covered the expansions in your Quake video. What? I haven't done a Quake video. Yeah, you have. You've done two. No, I haven't. You told me not to do one yet. Ah, that's right. The first one was in a different timeline, and the other one you haven't even made yet. Oh, come on, what the shit, dude? Don't get all convoluted here. Look, just talk about it. You know you want to. You sure it's okay? Like at some point I'm gonna go ahead and cover the Quake expansions too, so this is okay? Yeah, of course. It's all good. Oh, alright. Hey, how come I end up covering the Quake expansions anyway? Because you figured it would be alright after covering the Hexen expansion. You motherfucker. Alright, since I've run through the base Hexen campaign with each of the classes, with Deathkings of the Dark Citadel, I think I'm going to leave it up to fate as to which character I'm going to be playing as. After all, this expansion is notoriously difficult, and I don't want to leverage anything in my favor unless the gods would have it. Originally released on September 3rd, 1996, Deathkings of the Dark Citadel is an expansion for Hexen, developed by Raven and published by id. The story of the expansion takes place immediately after the end of Hexen, in which the three characters have defeated Korax, but found themselves somehow thrown into the realm of the dead after claiming the Chaos Sphere. With the sphere powerless in the realm of the dead, we are tasked with making our way to the Citadel of the Deathkings, the three lords who rule this realm, and destroying them is our only path to freedom. So if Hexen is an indifferent, frustratingly designed game that intentionally pushes back against the player to make the victory ultimately more rewarding, Deathkings of the Dark Citadel is a densely layered, hostile environment that actively hates the player for choosing to even boot up the game. Let me put it another way. Heretic, Fantasy Doom. Hexen, Fantasy Doom Eternal. Deathkings, Fantasy Ancient Gods Part 1. Brutal, complex, obtuse, and confounding. Deathkings contains 3 new hubs, along with a prologue and epilogue level. We have the Ruined Village prologue, then Hub 1, Blight, Hub 2, Constable's Gate, Hub 3, the Nave, and the epilogue, the Dark Citadel itself. Now, there's a part of me that kind of wants to go over this expansion with just as much of a fine-tooth comb as I just did with Hexen. There's also a part of me that wants absolutely nothing to do with Deathkings of the Dark Citadel ever again. Okay, so you know how Winnowing Halls as a prologue to Hexen was a short experience that gave the player a brief, gentle introduction to how the rest of the game was gonna feel? Fuck that. Ruined Village clocks the player immediately over the head with a score of Ettins, Afrits, and Chaos Serpents as soon as they enter the game, and it is no looking back from there. Since I was playing as the cleric, I found the Serpent Staff pretty much immediately, in the first fucking room. That is one of the few instances of mercy that Deathkings provides, and it is also a grim portent of the ills to befall you if they're granting you a blue mana weapon off the jump. With Hexen having already provided gamers the blueprint for what to expect from an experience of this kind, Raven was able to do away with the teaching moments and the guidance of leading players through several layers of understanding how themed keys and context-based items and switch puzzles would work. Here, with Deathkings, the kid gloves are off. This is Hexen on hard mode. So many puzzles involve searching back and forth across the automap to try and figure out where secret walls could potentially be, while desperately trying to outlast and outwit legions of enemies, amongst whom are multitudes of centaurs and slaughtars. Mostly slaughtars. Did I use the oops all centaurs joke already? Because oops all fucking slaughtars! Hell, you can find a piece of the super weapon for each class in the fucking prologue level. Deathkings, off the bat, is beating the player over the head that they're going to need all the help that they can get and then some. Blight tasks us with finding more of those gemstones that we had to track down in the Heresiarch Seminary, this time traveling back and forth across 4 separate areas, one of which has 4 death wyverns patrolling the sky. Yeah, you heard that right, kids. 4 fucking death wyverns. The Constable's Gate opens up with a fight against the Heresiarch. It opens up with a fight against the Heresiarch. And it continues the tomfoolery by asking you to track down the heads of 3 statues. Remember the Head of Yorick puzzle from the Castle of Grief? Did you enjoy that? Well, let's do it again, but this time with 3 statues. The Nave is essentially a massive chapel filled with a horde of monsters that ambush you right at the start, in an area filled with small pools of water that monsters can teleport between. And if you happen to be standing in one of those pools when a monster emerges, you can, and will, be telefragged. This shit is fucking nuts. and I absolutely fucking love it. Now, Deathkings is not going to be for everyone. If Hexen isn't exactly going to be everyone's cup of tea, Deathkings is like fucking Four Loko or some shit. I don't know. You know, the kind of drink that your friends all collectively understand is the most extreme example of something that they can consume, so none of them choose to drink it. But at the same time, you all know that one dude who will still drink it, and they're maybe the kind of person who doesn't make the best decisions surrounding their own personal health.
Dude, Four Loko? I love Four Loko. That shit is dope as hell. I drink it every morning. It's also how I snuggle crack across the US, but don't tell the FDA that.
Yeah, that's what someone who enjoys Deathkings is like. And after saying that, I now realize how it must sound when I say I love Deathkings. It would take too long to dive deep into the tomfoolery that is Deathkings of the Dark Citadel right now. Fun fact though, the name of the game came from a conversation that John Romero had with Sandy Peterson, in which Romero asked Sandy to come up with, quote, the most metal name for a D&D module, unquote. And apparently Sandy didn't even hesitate, he just blurted out Deathkings of the Dark Citadel. That's magic right there, kids. In a lot of ways, Deathkings is like a greatest hits album when compared to base Hexen. You've got all of the twisted, complicated pathfinding and obtuse puzzling and grueling combat, but none of the padding. Outside of 3 new hubs to explore, comprising a total of 20 new levels, plus a new deathmatch hub, Deathkings doesn't introduce any new weapons, enemies, or even new pieces to the soundtrack. Hell, the game doesn't even have the ability to play the music from the CD. It was patched in later iterations of the game. And while the GOG version has said patch integrated in, the Steam version of the game unfortunately does not. Meaning, for me, I played through all of Deathkings without Kevin Schilder's magnificent soundtrack playing in the background. I just got to engage with the haunting, sometimes overwhelming sounds of the environment and the enemies and the weapons. Something about playing this game with no music, though, lends to the ominous atmosphere. So I actually kind of like that. Every enemy from Hexen makes a return here, including the Wendigos and the Reavers. And you remember how Ettins will respawn indefinitely throughout the areas of Hexen to keep the maps populated? In Deathkings, any enemy can and will respawn. Water-filled maps will see Stalkers respawn. Slaughtars and Death Bishops will respawn. It's just fucking... Deathkings almost dares you to play it. Fucking dares you. It is an unholy, unwieldy game that, for better and for worse, strips away all the slower elements of Hexen and instead condenses all the puzzles and combat into a thick, merciless layer cake full of dread and hate. Very rarely are we given any handholding when we accomplish tasks in this game, any direction as to where to go next. And even when we are, the notes are so cryptic that it feels almost like the game is teasing us. At some point, I am going to do a full video on Deathkings. You know, a proper 3 times over, once with each class type of gameplay experience. I initially meant to go over this expansion deeper than I am right now, but as I'm writing this, looking back over footage I captured of the game, I am remembering just how deep and dense this game is, and I am already viscerally tired. Believe me when I say that there is a deep, deep part of me that wants to examine this expansion step by grueling step, through waves of Slaughtars and Stalkers, across desolate landscapes filled with insidious booby traps and item hunting. So for now, I just want you kids to understand that this is one of the most exhausting, exhilarating, and enjoyably masochistic gameplay experiences I have ever had. It gets a little bullshitty in certain puzzles, and sometimes is a complete dick towards the player. But Deathkings of the Dark Citadel is a worthy follow-up to Hexen, and if you're going to give it a go, I highly recommend jumping in as soon as you're done with the base campaign, so you still have Hexen's mechanics still working their way through your head. Because believe you me, kids, you're going to need it. And with that, we have made our way across the realm of Kronos, conquered our demons and our masters, and we put the second of 2 Serpent Riders to rest. Hexen is a masterpiece that isn't afraid to be confusing and confounding, but it also makes sure to put in the work so that the intentional design can and will lead to some of the most rewarding gameplay I have ever had. And while this game isn't for everyone, I think we can all agree that Raven put everything they had into this installment of the Serpent Riders trilogy, and I think it paid off. Alright kids, that's all the time I have for this episode of the History of FPS. On the next installment, we're going to be going back out into the reaches of outer space to run yet another marathon, this time against a familiar enemy, and maybe discover something about ourselves that we may or may not be prepared for. Thank you all so much for coming along this journey with me. Remember that patrons and channel members get access to videos early, and it also helps me pay bills while I work on these huge projects. Sit up straight, stay hydrated, stay safe out there, kids. I'll see you next time.